Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, and I just want to provide an end of year outlook. Talk about what I would consider to be the most likely path, um, what to look for in case Ethereum deviates from that path, and we'll just take it from there. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, I have a lot to talk about today in this video, and a lot of what we're going to talk about has been sort of like, a lot of what we previously said has actually been happening this year. Essentially, that when the ETH Bitcoin valuation breaks down, that generally marks the pullback, the larger correction by the ETH USD valuation. So remember, ETH Bitcoin started to break down back over here in January. There was a wick below it, and then it really started to move below it in late March, early April. Now, when I talked about this back then, I think it was really difficult for a lot of people to sort of visualize how that could possibly happen, especially given the ETF news for Ethereum that occurred in May. But what's fascinating is that history, in fact, did repeat itself. And, I spent many nights sort of stressing about the ETH Bitcoin valuation and how could it be different this time. It didn't seem like it should. It didn't seem like the ETF should make a big difference for the ETH Bitcoin valuation. And, I think so many people were against me that I had trouble, expressing it a ton. I mean, I did express it, but I didn't want to, say it every single day. I mean, you guys know my thoughts on the matter at this point. But when you look back, what do you notice? When you look back and sort of the dust has settled, what do you notice? You notice that ETH Bitcoin started to break down here in late March, early April of 2024. And you'll also notice that in 2016, ETH Bitcoin started to break down, but in June of 2016, sort of a fake breakdown. This time, the fake breakdown occurred in April. But if you look back at June of 2016 and March/April of 2024, what you'll notice is that in March, that marked the top for ETH USD, at least so far this year. And I would contend it could easily be the top for the rest of the year. If you look at 2016, when ETH Bitcoin had the sort of the false breakdown in June, that's when ETH USD topped out. So what you'll notice is that both in 2016 and in 2024, when ETH Bitcoin broke support, even though it was a fake out the first time, when it broke support, that's what marked the top for ETH USD. And what ended up happening back then, if we take a price range, after the top in June, ETH USD then fell approximately 72% or so, give or take. I mean, I didn't maybe measure it exactly. Maybe this is a little high. So about 71%. About 71% drop. That is what happened. Okay? Now, if you just measure it from the weekly close, it dropped about 60%. If you ignore the wick, if you just look at the weekly close, it dropped approximately 60%. Now, if you look at 2019, from the wick here, it dropped around 68 to 69%, excluding the pandemic. Again, a lot of times when I do these videos, I get in trouble with people because they're like, well, you can't include the pandemic. I'm not, right? I'm not. I'm just simply showing what happened before the pandemic, about a 68% drop. If you just take it from the weekly close, it was about a 62% drop. So in line with what happened over here, about a 61 to 62% drop. Now, if you go to this cycle and you ignore the wick, right? If you ignore the wick and you just look at the weekly close, so far, ETH has dropped around 51%. 51%. But a 60% drop would actually take it down to around 1,500. If it drops, say, 70% from the wick, which is what, this one also did right here, right? If you take it from the wick, about a 68, 69% drop. From this wick over here, about a 70% drop. So if you take it from the wick right there, which went above 4K, a 70% drop gets you all the way down to around $1,200. Now, obviously, a lot of people are going to be mad. And the path matters, though, right? And I'm not saying it has to happen right now, right? I'm not. It doesn't have to happen immediately. It could, but if actually it follows 2016 and 2019, it won't happen until late September into October, November timeframe. So let's take a look at that. Because one of the things that I put out a video at the end of August every year where I say, wake me up when September ends. And the reason for that video is because, actually, I want to leave that one up. The reason for that video is because normally, if you look at monthly returns for crypto, September is not a good month. But I want to go look at Ethereum, and I want you to look at 2016 and 2019. Now, in 2016 and in 2019, Ethereum was green that month. And what do 2016 and 2019 have in common with 2024? Well, 2016 was a halving year for Bitcoin, just like 2024. 2019 has similarities because it was also the year that the Fed cut rates during the last cycle. So whether you look at 2016 or whether you look at 2019, ultimately, September was green, right? It was green. And so then it raises the question, well, if it is green in September, why am I calling for it to potentially go lower later this year? Right? If it can go green in September, could it also be green October, November, December? Anything's possible, guys. I felt very strongly about various things before. Some of the theories that I come up with pan out, some of them don't. And so I do want to talk about, things to look for to say, all right, well, maybe it's not taking the path. But the first thing I would say is if ETH does go up in late August and early to mid-September, where could it go, right? How high could it go? And what I'm going to do to answer that question is to just look at, well, what did it do in 2016 and in 2019? And also, are there any clues today? Well, in 2019, it's almost eerily similar. ETH USD went down in August, and then it went up into the bull market support band in September, and it topped the week of September 16th. The week of September 16th. That's when it topped. Where is the bull market support band right now? Around 3K to 3,200. Now that's going to keep on coming down, but it's between $3,000 to $3,200. Now, what's interesting is that if you pull up the CME gaps, so if you pull up Bitcoin futures and you look at Bitcoin, and I don't do this that often, you guys know that, but if you pull it up for Bitcoin, you'll see that there was a gap that Bitcoin filled at around 62, around what, 62, we go to the low there, 62,470, and then this high right there got close to filling it, right? It hasn't actually filled it yet. Did this one over here? Yeah, this one right here filled it, right? So let me remove the bull market support band. So if you look at this wick right here, you can see that gap got filled. But if you look at the same chart for Ethereum, it hasn't been filled yet. You see that? There's a gap at 3K. There's a gap at 3K. So if we followed 2016 and 2019 and ETH does go up in September, from the current price, a 3K ETH is about a 13 to 14% move up. About a 13 to 14% move up. If you look at monthly returns for ETH in 2016, guess what? It moved up about 14%. Again, I'm not suggesting it has to go there. Normally, when I have sort of a base case narrative that it'll go down later on, I don't really care if it goes back up to that level or not. But if you want to hedge your bets, there does always exist a scenario where it goes up in September, and instead of following the route I'm suggesting in Q4, it always could just keep on going up, right? So I don't want people to fall into the trap of thinking like, oh, well, you know, Ben says it'll do this, and so I'm just going to sit on my hands, and then if it doesn't go down in October, November, then you get mad at me. So I would first say it's worthwhile to hedge your bets, but I at least want to provide the reasoning for it, you know? And again, you know, there's going to be critics, and that's honestly, that's obviously perfectly fine. My rebuttal to the critics is mostly that I don't really think any of them had a $1,900 ETH on their bingo card in August, whereas it was always my base case, right? And the reason it was my base case was because, well, it came back into the wedge. And how many times have I said that's what's likely going to happen? Also, if you look at Ethereum in 2016, the first week of August, it had a big wick down. So my base case was for it to go back down to those levels because, well, that's what it always does after ETH Bitcoin breaks down. So if you're going to throw the shade at the view, I would say, you know, take a step back, think about, you know, did you have $1,900 ETH on your bingo card for August? If you didn't, then I think you should at least be open-minded, just like I'm trying to be open-minded about, you know, maybe I'm wrong in Q4, okay? And it's possible, and I will talk more about that. I mean, it is possible, so I'll try to be open-minded about that, but I do at least want to present the case for the other outcome. So, in 2016, ETH carried out a very specific pattern, and it's basically verbatim this time. And what I'm talking about, if you look at ETH in 2016, every month that was green in 2016 for ETH has been green in 2024. January, February, March, January, February, March. May and May, and then you can see April was red for 2016 and 2024, and then May was green. June, July, August was red, 2024, and in 2016, June, July, and August was red. Now, August could theoretically turn green, but it would have a long way to go to get to being green, considering it's currently down 18%. Then in 2016, ETH was green in September. So if the 2024 pattern is going to continue and ETH is green in September, it might make people think that the analysis I'm presenting has to be wrong if it's green in September. But I'm suggesting that there still would be a scenario where it then goes down October, November, December. Okay? Now, also look at 2019, because in 2019, ETH was also red in July and August, sort of leading into September. It was green in September and then barely green in October, but then very red in November and December. So regardless of whether it was 2016 or 2019, ETH went down in Q4. And the best way to look at that would be to look at quarterly returns. So if you look at quarterly returns for ETH, you can see that in 2016, ETH went down in Q4, negative 39%. If you look at 2019, it went down in Q4, 28%. If you look at 2024, it's possible, right, that it goes down in Q4 again. So another thing to look at is and I'll get to the wedge a little bit later. It's a little bit more dubious. But if you look at monthly candles, for Ethereum, and you just look at the logarithmic regression band, one of the things you'll notice on here is that in August of 2016, ETH had a correction, and the correction stopped right at the top of the regression band, just like it did in August of 2024, right? And then in 2019, in August, ETH also went down to right into the regression band. So August 2016, August 2019, August 2024 all look really similar. And they all have something in common, right? 2016 is like 2024 because it's a Bitcoin halving year. 2019 is like 2024 because it was the year the Fed cut rates. And in both scenarios, ETH USD in August had a correction, a pretty large correction at that. And then in both years, September was green, and then Q4 was red. Now, in 2016, it was all 3 months. In 2019, October was barely green, 0.5%, and then November, December was pretty red. But what do you notice about both 2016 and 2019? They both ended the year with ETH at the lower logarithmic regression trend line. That's where they ended the year. Now, one of the things I've struggled with some this year is the fact that there's this pattern by ETH USD that played out in 2016. And this is honestly, it honestly was a hurdle for kind of my view for a long time. And the reason is because I was looking at this over here and thinking, well, you know, what happened back then was that ETH got into this channel, this range, where it just oscillated between that range, right? And it really didn't deviate out of it that much. And then the following year, ETH broke out. So it's possible that ETH does go to new all-time highs, but it might not happen until next year. In fact, when ETH USD had this initial surge in March, while it did wick above it in June, ETH USD did not durably go above that March 16 high until March of 2017. So it was a full year later. What if something similar happens, right? Where it's essentially you have to wait a full year after that March 2024 rally before you actually see another high. It's possible. But again, where was the issue? Like, what the issue that I was struggling with was this. If you look in 2016, the wick in August just took you back down to the range low, right? So I was looking at 2024 and I'm like, well, if ETH just goes back down to the range low, then how can that be? Like, how can it go back down, you know, to where I think it could go if it's just going to continue this pattern? Because even if it sold off into Q4, it would still only sweep the prior low, right? It would only sweep the prior low even if it sold off in Q4. So if ETH does rally in September and then sweeps the prior low in Q4, had the low stopped at 2,500, which is essentially the equivalent of where it stopped in August of 2016, then it would have meant only going down to like 2,400. But in this case, ETH USD went actually quite a bit further down than that. It went all the way down to 1,900. Now, why is that important? One of the things I've suggested is that this cycle could be a combination, or this year could be really a combination of what we saw in 2019 with rate cuts and 2016 with this pattern, where these wicks to the downside are actually going much further than they did in 2016. One thing to keep in mind is that in 2016, after this wick down, after the wick, ETH USD weekly candles were all the way back up here, near, you know, sort of mid-range, closer to the top of the range. But now, those weekly candles are still way down here at the bottom of the range, suggesting that this is a slightly weaker version of 2016. Now, you don't really have to go guessing too much because you can see what happened with ETH in 2019 when the Fed cut rates. And this is something I've expressed to you guys plenty over the last several years. And essentially, it goes something like this. If you look at US interest rates, you will see that ETH USD rallied into the pause, and it formed a wedge. You see that wedge? It formed this wedge right here. And then at some point, it broke out of the wedge before rate cuts. And then as rate cuts arrived, it fell back into the wedge, right? Just before rate cuts arrived, because you can see it was falling down July 8th. We didn't get rate cuts until the very last week of July. It was like July 31st, in fact, I think is when the rate cuts actually. I'm just fixing this so that it makes a little bit more sense. But it was actually July 31st where you had rate cuts, and you can see ETH USD fell back into that wedge in July. And then after rate cuts, ETH USD sold off. You see that? And it went below the wedge after rate cuts arrived. Now look at this cycle. I've argued this for like a long time. You could argue that this wedge is the equivalent of what you saw in 2019. You could argue that, right? And it's just bigger because the hiking cycle was bigger. But do you see the similarities? And so perhaps the reason why Ethereum in 2024 has been a slightly weaker version of 2016 is because there's also some elements of what happened in 2019 baked into the price action, where it actually did go below some of those lows that were previously set. So there exists a scenario as well where ETH USD does not get a big rally in September, and maybe it just says to hell with 3K, and it just kind of slowly grinds back into this wedge right here. Now it could wick back up, right? I mean, if you look over here closely at what ETH USD did back in 2019, what you'll notice is that right before rate cuts, or right around the time of rate cuts, it actually did have a wick up, right? Where from the low, it rallied like 25, 26%. So it actually did get a pretty nice bounce off the low. And from the weekly close, it still rallied about 14%. Now, a 14% rally for ETH USD from that weekly close would put it back at around 2,900 or so. So around that $3,000 mark. So you could have a scenario like 2019 where it still fades into this wedge, but it doesn't mean it can't wick back up to, to 3K or something to fill the gap. So then I was wondering, well, what's interesting about this September? Because if you look closely at ETH USD in 2019 in September, you can see it rallied. It bled into August, and then September it rallied, and then it topped the week of September 16th. And then the following week, it got a big drop, and it erased all those prior gains that it had in September. You see that? The last week of September. Now, but again, it topped September 16th. Now go to 2016, and we're going to do the same exercise. What happened in September of 2016? ETH USD rallied. You see that? Same rally. It rallied, and it topped the week of September 19th. Was flat the following week, and then in October, it got a pretty big sell-off. So what do you notice? September 19th, the week of September 19th, and the week of September 16th is when ETH USD put in its lower high. What's going on this September? Around September 16th, September 18th, right? This was, September 19th. Around September 16th to the 19th. What's going on? I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at what the Fed's going to do. Well, the next Fed meeting, September 18th, and they're likely going to cut interest rates by at least 25 basis points. My guess is they're going to cut 25 basis points. So you have a scenario here where you can see exactly what happened in 2016, going into September, and going into September in 2019. And in both cases, ETH USD had a little bit of a rally, right? Had a little bit of a rally, and then it gave everything back and more in Q4. And then it was the following year that the market picked back up. And then you had a recession, and obviously that changed things. But again, it was the following year that the market durably picked back up. So when you look at 2016, if you want to compare it to a halving year, because I think the biggest criticism I've gotten this year is, why do you keep comparing Bitcoin to 2019? Why don't you compare it to 2020 or 2016? Well, again, this is one of those scenarios where a lot of the people that were the most vocal about how crazy it was compared to 2019 were also saying that we were going to go to much higher prices by now. And now you look at it and you're like, oh, well, it kind of just looks like 2019, right? It's a tempered version of it, but it still looks more similar to 2019 than it really did to, say, anything going on over here. Why is that? Well, gold broke out around the same time. USDT dominance hit its trend line, its long-term trend line at the same time. And that told you that it was likely time for a correction. And I said many times we'd likely get a correction when gold broke out and when ETH Bitcoin broke down. And honestly, it was really hard for me when the ETF was going to get approved for Ethereum. I was kind of in a tough spot, because on one side, I was like, I want this stuff to be approved, but on the other side, it's like everyone's dunking on me because, they think it wasn't included in the model or something, or in my views. And I said before, I don't really think the ETF impacts that. It could, right? I'm not saying it can't, but that was my view back then. So, I keep going back to this idea that what if ETH is just playing out like 2016 and 2019? And I was thinking, how can that be if the regression band for Ethereum is way down here, and in 2016 it never durably broke, it never really went below the range low, with the exception of this single wick. So I was looking at 2024 and I'm like, well, unless it goes really far below it, how can it possibly get to the bottom of the logarithmic regression trend line? How? But I feel like you have your answer now, right? I mean, because you can see that this wick went down to it just like it did in August of 2016. It's just that it required a deeper correction to get there, just like it did in 2019. So I'm saying that it's a combination of that and this, where it looks like 2016 in the sense of a top in March and a top in June, right? A top in March and then a top in June. And then the next top was in September. But because ETH USD is still at the range low, the next local top for Ethereum, if it follows that pattern, might not even make it back to 4K, because again, when it made it over here to that wick low, the weekly closes were back up in the mid part of the range, whereas these weekly closes are at the lower part of the range. So if you do get a rally, it might just be back up to the bull market support band. Because if you look in 2016, ETH USD rallied and stayed above the bull market support band on its weekly closes. You see that? This wick was just a wick, and then it was back above the 21-week EMA, and it stayed above it through September, and then it finally lost it in Q4. But if you look at 2019, when rate cuts occurred, it also lost the bull market support band, and then when it rallied in September, it got rejected by the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. And remember, where is the 20-week SMA now? It's at around 3,200, but it's going to continue coming down. Where's the 21-week EMA? It's around $30,050. Where's the gap, the CME gap? It's right around $3,000. So again, you could always have a scenario where you get a path that looks something like this, where ETH USD goes back up to the bull market support band in September, let's say by the week of September 16th, and then sells off again into the end of the year, and then gets a big bounce out of it next year, right? That is always a possibility. Now, it doesn't have to happen, right? I could be wrong about this view, but I think it's at least worth considering, especially if you didn't have $1,900 ETH on your bingo card. Granted, long term, I don't think $1,900 ETH is going to be that bad of a price if you're thinking about what the price of Ethereum could be in 10 years. But you can see that in both 2016 and in 2019, same general pattern, whether you take it, whether you look at it like that or you look at the wedge, and you could look at it the same way, whether you look at it like that or you look at this longer term wedge, it's kind of doing the same thing, whether your bias is 2019 comparison or whether your bias is a 2024 comparison. It's a weaker, or the 2016 comparison. It's a weaker version of 2016, and it's been a longer version than 2019 in terms of how long this has taken. You want to see something really interesting? It's dubious. I should probably have my dubious speculation t-shirt on. Look at this pattern. I don't know why I focus on this stuff, but sometimes once you see it, you can't unsee it. Look at this pattern by ETH in 2019. So from low to low, 8 weeks. From this low, if you like connect the sorry, I'm trying to I need to get the bull market square pin off here so I can see these wicks a bit easier. So if you connect, yeah, these lows, so this one to this one and this one to this one and this one over here. 8 weeks, and then connect it again. From here, sorry, from right here to this one. 12 weeks. Connect this one to the next one. 12 weeks. 8, 12, 12. Okay. Who cares, right? Interesting pattern. Keep it in mind. 8, 12, 12. So this was 50% more. The second touch was 50% longer on the trend line. So it was 8 weeks and then 12 weeks and then 12 weeks. So it was like 2 months and then 3 months and then 3 months. Now look over here. Really similar. It's just longer. I pointed this out before. 23 weeks. Then 46 weeks. So instead of 50% more, double. Double. So 23 to 46. Double. Go out 46 again. Right around this time. Right? And you can see we already wicked back down there. So I look at this stuff and I'm like, it really just seems like a longer version of it. And it's just taking so long to play out that it's easy to sort of disregard and say, yep, that can't happen, right? It's easy to disregard. But I will say, it's possible that I'm wrong about this. And I would say that if I am wrong about it, my guess is that, you would really need to see ETH taking out this high right here, right? So if it can take out 3,500, then that would be evidence that my view is wrong. And you should no longer, think too much about my view in that case, because then it would seem to be deviating a lot. If it were to, say, put in a higher high. If it goes back to 3K, that's not anything different than what you might otherwise expect. In fact, if you connect this low to that low right there, you can see how if ETH USD were to go back up to the bull market support band by like mid-September, that's where it could easily get rejected and then go back down. Remember, after ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETH USD gets a pretty big drop. It already got one, but it's possible that it gets another. And if it does get another big drop, that could be your, what you would consider to be a soft landing. A lot of people have said, do you have to have a hard landing for ETH USD to get this drop? I think a soft landing can do it, right? I mean, in 2016, we dropped down here 70%. We didn't have a hard landing. In 2019, we dropped down here. We didn't have a hard landing. The hard landing came the following year, and then it went below the regression band. So I think that in that case, you have to think that, like, you don't have to have a hard landing just for ETH to go down. In fact, a lot of people are confused why ETH is going down because the NASDAQ's going up, right? And if you overlay the NASDAQ onto this chart, it shouldn't be that weird. When the year the Fed cut rates last cycle, 2019, ETH USD started to go down. The NASDAQ was still going up. Here, right? The NASDAQ while ETH has been going down, the Nasdaq's still been going up. It's not that crazy, right? I mean, it really isn't. It's the same thing. But we complicate it. Like, we overcomplicate it and we say, well, this time is different. But the reason is because, ETH is further out on the risk curve, right? It's further out on the risk curve, therefore, than the NASDAQ. Therefore, it sells off sooner, right? And that's why I think ETH has been struggling and the NASDAQ has done a lot better. And even here, the NASDAQ was going up even after ETH went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. Even over here, when in 2016, when ETH went down to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, the NASDAQ was going up that entire time. So you can't really look at the NASDAQ and say, well, if it's going up, ETH has to go up. Because in 2016, when ETH went to the lower logarithmic regression trend, which I've called home before, obviously, and I've been mocked relentlessly for it. But when it went there, the NASDAQ was going up. In 2019, when it went there, the NASDAQ was going up. Guess what? NASDAQ's been going up. ETH has been going down since March. So my guess is that if ETH were to get a rally, I would guess that it wouldn't go much higher than 3K. I would guess it would get rejected by the bull market support band this year and go above the bull market support band again next year. That's what I would guess. I could be wrong, and I feel like I've grown a lot as an investor because the market's humble everyone. I'd like to think that my loudest critics have also been humbled, but I don't think I think they'll always find a reason to troll or whatever. Even though the dunks that occurred back over here and over here were all premature because ETH just went down. But we're all on our own journey. And I think everyone's kind of in a different position. So I do think there is a case to be made that this could play out, right, after all this time. I think if it's going to play out, the finale of it won't likely be until the end of the year. Because in 2016, the low occurred in December before it bounced. And in 2019, the low occurred in December before it bounced. So because of that, if history were to repeat itself in 2024, if the pattern continues, my guess is that it won't really get a durable bounce that can take it to new highs until 2025. That doesn't mean that 3K can't happen. It just means that it's going to be a lot harder to see, the higher prices that people want to see. And I think the biggest thing that people have overlooked is the importance of Bitcoin valuations for cryptocurrencies. Because in both 2016 and in 2019, when ETH Bitcoin broke support, ETH USD then dropped 60 to 70%. Now, ETH Bitcoin could actually be a lot closer to finding a low than ETH USD in terms of, the current trends. Normally, after ETH Bitcoin breaks down, it finds a low within about 3 months or so. So, it's certainly possible that ETH Bitcoin could find a low really soon. And as I've said before, if it doesn't go below 0.04 before the end of the year, then that's my guess is that's the bottom. I still think there's a good case that it could go lower than 0.04. But if it doesn't happen by the end of December, then it's probably not going to happen. So that's generally my view. And as far as ETH Bitcoin, I would say that, if it does this, right, if it gets a big sell-off into the end of the year, and then in 2025, it would probably get a bigger bounce. If it gets a slower sell-off, then next year it probably gets a smaller bounce. And if it just stays sideways, if it goes up here and then back down and then back up, my guess it would be an even more pathetic bounce. So the lower it goes, the more impressive the 2025 bounce is what I would say. But yeah, those are my views. Definitely could be wrong. And, I think some other pieces of evidence that could support if ETH does go back up to that level is that some of the lower market cap alts are starting to pop off a little bit. So it kind of seems like they're sniffing out the rate cut. They're wanting to rally into the rate cut as well. In fact, if you were to look at like others Bitcoin, you'll notice that a lot of times when it sets a low and then sort of double bottoms, rally back up to the bull market support band and then go down, right here. Low, double bottom, rally back to the 20-week SMA, and then go down. Same thing. Low, double bottom. Does it rally back up to 20-week SMA and then go down? It's possible, right? Even total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, right? It's going back up potentially to that bull market support band. So those are my views. I could be wrong, and if I am wrong, then I will try to be as quick as I can to tell you I'm wrong. My guess is that I would say it in October. I mean, that's, that would be the time frame at which I would find out if my view in Q4 is wrong or not, right? I mean, if ETH continues to aggressively go up in October, then I think my view would be wrong. And if it fades after the rate cut arrives, then I think there's more evidence to suggest that my view could be correct. So that's where I am right now. I think it makes sense to be hedged, obviously. I've said that before, especially with ETH Bitcoin all the way at 0.043. I can't tell you how many nights I was so stressed about this stupid ratio. And, I was right about it the entire time. But, there's one thing I've learned. There's nothing waiting for you at the end of being right. There's nothing waiting for you. Doesn't really matter. And I that's kind of a lesson I've learned the hard way. A lot of people don't care about Bitcoin valuations. So there's nothing really waiting for you at the end of being right about stuff like this. So I don't think I'm going to be as vocal next cycle about it. But that's where we stand in the Cryptoverse. Those are my views on Ethereum. And I would say that if ETH is going to rally, my guess is it's going to do it in September. If you look at the 2019 view, it won't be as impressive of a rally. If you look at the 2016 view, it'll be slightly more impressive, but still be a lower high. That's where I think the market stands. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.